The rigid silence of the Roman temple was broken only by trembling breath. The moment a child felt the weight of the world settle on her shoulders. Forget what you've heard about golden coins and triumphal processions. Behind Rome's splendor lay a law harsher than iron, one that demanded not just victory but purity. Today, we step inside the sacred halls of the Vestals, girls taken from their families to serve Rome's law of purity. They weren't pampered priestesses, they were hostages to an idea, selected not for faith, but for the perfection of innocence. Citizens gathered as magistrates pointed to the chosen, sometimes as young as 6. Their bodies no longer belonged to their mothers, fathers, or themselves. They belonged to Rome, symbols of virginity, whose flesh bore the price of the empire's survival. In Rome, the expectation was clear and unmistakable. The state demanded living emblems of moral perfection. Not even gods were so strictly policed. Why did Rome create such a law? Political control, disguised as holiness. The city's foundation myth swirled with tales of violated Vestals, punished not for lust but for failing Rome. The survival of Rome's spirit depended, citizens believed, on unbroken purity. A single slip threatened, not just the woman, but the city itself. Under the law of purity, sacrifices weren't always bloody. Sometimes they were silent, lifelong sentences. Each year, families steeled themselves, knowing the lottery for Vestal selection meant hope for status, but the terror of loss, chosen girls were paraded for approval. Old women scanned every gesture for signs of impurity or hesitation. The tiniest hint of defiance could doom a family's reputation for generations. The rituals for these girls began at sunrise. Heads shaved to erase old bonds, hands scrubbed in river water as priests invoked vows no child could comprehend. The law of purity was carved into ceremonies and oaths as tight as chains. These girls learned early voice, thought, even dreams must serve the state. Any sign of rebellion would be met with whispers, investigations, and threats whispered with smiles. The price of virginity was constant surveillance. For most, the transition marked the end of childhood. In a city famed for its elaborate marriages and fierce mothers, the Vestals were tasked with remaining apart from all things womanly. And yet, for some, that isolation conferred power, authority few Roman men could match. This truth would haunt their service. Some Vestals tried to wield that power for justice, others for quiet rebellion. But above all, every day was a test. Rome's greatest fear wasn't invasion or famine, but the possibility that those who embodied purity would let corruption slip quietly past the temple doors. The law of purity would be enforced with a cruelty both public and private, shaping the fates of thousands for centuries. Roman life was defined by the lottery of birth and the judgment of elders. But for girls destined for the temple, fate was even more arbitrary. Selection for the Vestal Virgins was a process steeped in ritual and prestige, yet terrified every family of means. The candidates came from Rome's noblest bloodlines, chosen for lineage, beauty, and above all physical perfection. But the process itself often felt more like a public inspection than a spiritual calling. Magistrates scanned daughters for crooked teeth, broken bones, or a hint of nervousness. The chosen were not the cleverest, nor even the most devout, but those whose bodies seemed most likely to survive 15 years of enforced celibacy. Unselected families, prepared for the loss, with mixed pride and grief. Being named a Vestal guaranteed status, but also an irreversible sundering from family life. The law of purity dictated that parents surrender authority, preventing maternal instinct from interfering with the imperatives of state control. Girls were escorted to the temple, sometimes by weeping mothers, more often by proud fathers who pretended not to fear what was to come. Their introduction was marked by an oath taken before the city's magistrates, a covenant between flesh and law. From that moment, the Vestal's life was dictated by a schedule harsher than any military training. Training began with silence. Young Vestals were not permitted to speak unless spoken to, forced to memorize rituals, prayers, and the exact measurements for sacrifices. Vestals lived under constant supervision by elder priestesses, who judged every movement and word with suspicion. They learned restraint, self-censorship, and the art of survival. Their days were split between tending holy fires, studying the calendar, and preparing for elaborate festivals that celebrated virginity as the foundation of Rome. Education was not for the mind at least not in the modern sense, but for the construction of the perfect public symbol. Terrifying stories were told to keep the novices compliant. The tale of a Vestal caught glancing at a soldier, the horror of the virgin whose vow was rumored broken, and the grisly fates that awaited transgressors. Physical pain, hunger, and humiliation were used to teach obedience. The law of purity did not accept mistakes. Any lapse, whether intentional or not, was a crisis proof that corruption could reach even Rome's holiest ground. Elders whispered rumors about spies among the acolytes, reinforcements for the state's internal intelligence. Brotherhood and affection between Vestals was discouraged. Trust was dangerous, and alliances could threaten the system's stability. Despite the terror, some found a kind of comfort in routine. The temple became their new family, with elder Vestals offering cryptic guidance, warm bread, and protection from the outside world. But even those relationships were fraught with risk. Jealousy, rivalry, and the constant fear of betrayal haunted the temple halls. The law of purity was not just about virginity, it was about control, isolation, and the molding of identity, until nothing was left of the girl who first entered the temple. For outsiders, the Vestals appeared serene and powerful. But for those inside, every day was a struggle for survival, with the law of purity always looming, ready to enforce the price of imperfection. If power means freedom, then the Vestals were paradoxical gods free from marriage, but trapped by law. Their dresses of pure white marked them as Rome's most sacred and most scrutinized lives. Each morning they awoke before the city stirred to tend the eternal flame, believed necessary for Rome's survival. Only they could approach the flame, and its extinction foretold disaster. Yet beneath the surface of these sacred acts ran an undercurrent of fear. Vestals were watched at all times. Envoys observed every gesture, servants too frightened to meet their eyes, city officials hovering as invisible threats. Vestals lived in luxury compared to most Roman women. They were allowed to own property, manage estates, and were immune from typical patriarchal restrictions. They sat in courts, made pronouncements, and were honored guests at every major festival. Even emperors bowed to them, knowing the law of purity gave them the power to save lives or damn cities. This privilege, however, was doubled. With each act of public leadership, suspicion grew. Elders and rivals looked for signs that pride or independence might violate the sanctity of virginity. In private, Vestals experienced profound loneliness, forbidden the comfort of family, sexual love, or even informal friendships. Their only solace came from ritual, art, and carefully directed acts of compassion. Old priests taught them to meditate for hours facing the flame, to bury emotion beneath repeated prayers. Young Vestals sometimes rebelled in small acts. A stolen laugh, a hidden note, a forbidden glance at the city below their walls. Such moments were rare and dangerous, but they proved the Vestals were still human beneath Rome's perfection. The law of purity extended into every aspect of daily life. Vestals could not touch the dead, bleed from wounds, or step on certain pathways. Their movements were choreographed, their meals dictated, their sleep monitored. The most minor error could result in investigation and punishment. Paranoia infected the temple like a disease system, perfected over centuries, designed not just to protect the flame, but to maintain absolute control over its guardians. Some Vestals wielded their position to influence the city's fate. A single word spoken to an emperor could sway justice, redirect fortunes, or spare condemned innocents. But this power always circled back to the risk of suspicion. Rome never forgot the law of purity. The more authority a Vesta gained, the sharper the eyes that watched her. Even the most revered priestess lived under threat of disgrace and death. In the city's eyes, purity was the ultimate strength and the ultimate vulnerability. With absolute purity came absolute risk. No group in Rome was so feared or so vulnerable to accusation as the Vestal Virgins. Jealous rivals, angry spurned suitors, and political enemies all knew that a single rumor could ruin a priestess forever. In the eyes of Roman law, there was no more serious crime than a Vestal's defilement. Suspicions need not be proven. They only needed to be voiced by someone with enough power. An innocent touch, a whispered word, a stray glance could spark investigations that unfolded with brutal efficiency. Scandals involving Vestals were public spectacles. While the city mourned the alleged violation, the accused was arrested and immediately placed in solitary confinement. Magistrates arrived to interrogate witnesses, search the temple, and review every detail of daily life. Even the victim's family could be swept up in disgrace, encountering mass shunning by neighbors terrified of contagious shame. The accused Vestal faced not just investigation, but psychological warfare. Interrogations designed to break her spirit, forced confessions whether or not the truth could be verified. Punishment for breaking the law of purity was as horrifying as it was unique. Execution was forbidden. Vestals could not be killed by blade or poison. Instead, Rome devised a ritual of living burial, a spectacle as chilling as any myth. The priestess was led through the city, head covered, feet bare, to a subterranean chamber, specially prepared beneath the earth. There, she was given a lamp, a loaf of bread, and a cup of water, ritual objects meant for survival. Alone, with only the ghosts of memory, she awaited death. Rome believed that killing the impure by burial cleansed the city of spiritual danger. Historical records detail numerous such tragedies. Perhaps the most famous was the case of Cornelia, a Vestal accused after failing to keep the flame alive. She pleaded innocence, but the law was relentless. Her death sent shockwaves through Rome. Even emperors were not immune. At least once, a member of the imperial family was implicated in a Vestal scandal and forced into exile. Accusations became weapons in political feuds, destroying reputations and upending careers. The law of purity was enforced not only with death, but with erasure. Families of disgraced Vestals lost property, status, and voice. All records related to the accused might be altered or destroyed, ensuring future generations would forget their name. Rome valued purity overall, and its vengeance was brutal even against the innocent. The process was not about justice. It was about maintaining the myth at any cost, reminding citizens that purity was a burden too heavy for most mortals to bear. No system can survive unchanging. Over centuries, the law of purity bent under the weight of Rome's own contradictions. As the empire expanded and absorbed new gods, the Vestals' power waned, but their risks remained just as high. Political instability brought new scrutiny to the priestesses, with rival factions eager to replace them or diminish their influence. Stories began to circulate of Vestals using secret lovers to maneuver through politics, of bribes between families seeking to avoid the dreaded selection. At the same time, the authority of old priests weakened, leaving Vestals vulnerable to manipulation. The collapse wasn't instant. It unfurled gradually, as changing values eroded the reverence for purity. Wealth, power, and pleasure began to mean more than the law's silent suffering. During the late Empire, some Vestals were permitted to marry after serving their years, a reversal unthinkable in earlier centuries. Temple rituals lost their grandeur, replaced by bureaucratic repetition and neglect. The eternal flame, once sacred, became a symbol of past glory, occasionally allowed to extinguish without disaster. Despite these reforms, Vestals continued facing fierce scrutiny. A final wave of accusations swept through the city, as old families struggled to preserve their privileges. In some cases, innocent girls were sacrificed by rivals attempting to curry favor with powerful priests or politicians. The imperial government, seeking to redefine civic virtue, ultimately abolished the law of purity. The temple was repurposed, the sacred flame extinguished, and the priestesses sent homophoon to families they barely remembered. The aftermath saw survivors struggle to adapt. Some married and tried to live normal lives, but found themselves forever marked by trauma, suspicion, and the ghosts of ancient expectation. Others faded into obscurity, remembered only through legal records and fragments of ritual found by archaeologists centuries later. The final Vestals were witnesses to the end of an era and epoch, when purity ruled more cruelly than any tyrant. The transition left Rome reeling, forced to confront the cost of centuries spent worshipping an ideal so brittle it shattered at the first sign of change. Today, historians debate the legacy of the law of purity. Some see it as evidence of Rome's sophisticated religious psychology. Others cite it as proof of the state's psychic violence against its own children. The ruins of the temple stand as silent reminders of dreams that became nightmares of girls, who paid the price for city grown too powerful to admit its own brokenness. History doesn't end with facts, it lingers in rituals, ruins, and the silent suffering of the forgotten. Rome's law of purity was not a myth, but a system designed for survival that demanded sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. The Vestals were both victims and symbols. They represented the heights of female authority, but also the depths of state control. Their lives remind us that purity is a weapon as dangerous as any sword. It can create sacred unity, but also breed suspicion and cruelty. Reflecting on the legacy of the Vestals forces us to reconsider the meaning of virtue in survival. Rome believed that purity could hold back chaos, that by enforcing it in human bodies, they could bind together a civilization. But the consequences were profound. Silence replacing song, fear replacing love, loneliness masked as sacred devotion. For centuries, the city lived in terror, not of enemies at the gate, but of the shadows cast by its own laws. Rome's greatest threat was always, in turn, of the fear that the law of purity was too much for even the bravest soul to bear. The ruins of the temple still whisper secrets. Archaeologists uncover objects buried with care, broken amulets, fragments of scrolls, even lamps, and bread from old executions. Each item is a message. Each ghostly record is a challenge to memory. What did the Vestals dream about on lonely nights? Which priestess rebelled in secret, leaving behind coded prayers? Which family mourned the loss of a daughter to a system that offered pride and heartbreak in equal measure? And there is a final mystery. Some ancient scrolls suggest that the law of purity was not merely about maintaining female virginity, but about invoking and nourishing an invisible power one that protected Rome's soul in ways we may never comprehend. Was virginity truly about spiritual strength? Or did it mask a darker obsession with control? Did the Vestals hold keys to rituals now lost forever? As you close this video, ask yourself, is virtue the path to greatness, or is it the brittle armor of a city terrified of collapse? Has the law of purity disappeared, or does it echo in the expectations placed on women even now? Share your theories and questions below. The truth is still buried waiting for those brave enough to uncover it. And remember, history's greatest mysteries are not the ones we solve, but the ones we dare to remember.